we're only in chapter one of Fredrickson's book, uh, but it's still a very timely chapter, especially if you are familiar. Several years ago, Denny, I know that you possibly read this book, a book called Constantine's Sword, about. Go ahead, Denny. Did you read it?
No, it's on my list.
Yeah. Well,
It,
it's a major tome, but it's really about the development of anti-Semitism throughout the history of Christianity. And really, it does begin with Constantine in many ways. But what Pagels is doing, Constantine in 312 or so of the Common Era, but what Pagels is doing is backing up and giving us, though she doesn't really say this in her chapter, as I'm reading it, I'm looking at, questions of anti-Semitism and their root cause or their source. And I think every paragraph I read, I see something of it. Go ahead, Denny.
are we talking about Pagels or
Well,
Fredrickson?
did I say Pagels? Fredrickson.
I'm,
I'm
I'm,
sorry. You planted that the name in my brain. Yeah,
my bad.
Paula Fredrickson. Yeah, we're talking about Paula Fredrickson. Uh, but I wanted to give a little background because the chapter we're reading is about the idea of Israel. Uh, and we're seeing how, Jesus is seen as the Messiah among his group of Jewish followers. It does not appear that there was a strong emphasis in Jesus' ministry from the earliest sources on, a ministry to the Gentiles. In fact, if you read the Gospel of Mark, Jesus appears to be in many ways anti-Gentile. Even the Gentiles do that, he says, right? And at one point, he tells a woman, I came not for the Gentiles, but for the children of Israel. And she responds by saying, well, even the dogs get the scraps from the table. So early texts about Jesus seem to locate him in a highly Jewish context. But as those texts get written, the notion or the idea about the Jews uh, becomes more transformed. It becomes transformed to the point that, by 100 of the Common Era, you have, well, though Fredrickson calls it intra-Jewish arguments, they will soon develop into anti-Jewish arguments. So from about 100 to about, well, 400 of the Common Era, by the time of Augustine, you see Christian apologists arguing against the role of God's people, the role of the Jews as God's people, as the covenant community. Christians come to see themselves as supplanting that community and seeing themselves as the new Israel. And so that we talked about that last time. That's pretty much where we left off. Pagels, excuse me, now you got Pagels. Fredrickson has got several references that are difficult. She makes it clear that we don't really know what the earliest conversations were in the Jewish synagogues at the time. We see references to those other Jews in a time that would have been contemporary with the development of the church, but we don't really see any real references apart from this Birkat HaManim, the other Jews that are referred to in Jewish references. So we don't really know what the synagogues were saying early on about uh, the God-fearers or Gentiles or even Jews who are following Jesus. So there's kind of like this dark period. Uh, but if we look at the passion narratives uh, that we saw just from Easter, when we look from Mark all the way to John, the shift takes place. There is blame that comes to be directed towards the Jews as those who killed their own Messiah. And this, of course, crescendos in the Gospel of John. If you read the last chapter where the Jews are hiding out and Jesus appears to them, and they're hiding out for fear of the Jews, it says in the text itself. And it is a very anti-Semitic and has been taken to task recently as being a very anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. It's probably a better way to say it because, at this time there were Semites who were Christians as well, but a very anti-Jewish gospel. And concomitant, happening at the same time with that is that as Jewish guilt in the execution of Jesus comes to be more and more pronounced, the role that Rome plays becomes less and less obvious, to the point that when we get to the Gospel of John, even Pilate himself is like, why are you even, executing this man? I don't see anything wrong with him. Pilate and Jesus have this wonderful philosophical conversation about truth, and Pilate is seen as a sympathetic character. But by the time you get, and this is where I'd like to pick up in a study of a text in the New Testament. By the time you get to the writing of Luke, it's already pretty clear that there is a separation among traditional Jewish followers, people who are meeting in the synagogues and following the law, and those who might be referred to as God-fearers, or those who have been baptized and are following Jesus as the Messiah. And this is where about 100 of the Common Era, the real vitriol, we might say, or at least the accusations begin. And it's present. Remember, Luke is the author of the Gospels, but he also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, and the two of those books are supposed to be read together. They're just two parts, of the same story. And that book opens up, Jesus at the end of Luke ascends to heaven, and we may presume gives the Great Commission to go into all the world. That comes from Matthew, actually, but when Luke opens up the Acts of the Apostles are in Jerusalem, and there is this rush of mighty winds, and of course the tongues of fire descend from the heavens. They begin to speak in tongues. And I want to point out here that when we're talking about tongues, we're not talking about, actually, I should say more clearly, they begin to speak in other languages. That's literally what the text says. Later on, there will be pagan mystery religions that speak in mystical languages, right? And that will be adopted by the church in some of the areas that Paul goes to. But in Luke, it's really clear that those who begin to speak in other languages are speaking earthly languages. So if you're in Jerusalem during the time of Shavuot, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, you're hearing these apostles speak your language, whether it's Greek or whether, whatever number of languages are present at that time. These are the nations, right, to whom the gospel is going out. So right from the start, you've got this theme that the gospel, that Jesus the Messiah is a Messiah for all nations. But you also have this other theme that is also going to play as the Acts of the Apostles develops. And I want to read Acts chapter 2, verses 22 to 23. Peter, of course, is the head of the church, and we hear a lot about Peter in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter is the one who has the vision of, the blanket descending from heaven, and there are all these types of meat on it, and he hears a voice, take up and eat, and he says, oh, I can't do that. There's some unclean things. And the voice says, no, now all things are clean. Another affirmation that the Gentiles can be accepted into the church. But the other underside of that, I guess you might say the corollary of that, is something that tends to also be present in the very second chapter of Acts that we're talking about here. So Peter is going to when people start hearing these other languages, Peter has to make some sort of explanation to the people. Tell us what's going on here. And Peter does this. I'm reading from Acts chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. Then I'll pick up on chapter 30 or verse 36 as well. But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem. We can presume women are there too, right? Let this be known to you and listen to what I say. Indeed, these people are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. I've always thought this is kind of silly because if you're a true drunk, you're usually drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? But anyway, no, these guys can't be drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Nobody's drinking at that time. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. So Peter is saying all of this is Old Testament prophecy come to pass. And here we have it. Here we have the beginning of interpreting Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament to the point where eventually Christian authors are going to see the so-called Old Testament is literally that, Old Testament, right? As foretelling the coming of the Messiah, and Jesus conforms to that pattern. But even as these prophets are being quoted, they are being reinterpreted. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So Peter reads from the prophet Joel, which is one of the hardest books in the Old Testament to find because it's just a short little God prophecy. And here's what the prophecy says. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. You that are Israelites, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, now he's speaking literally to the Jews, okay? You who are Israelites, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders and signs that God did through him among you, as you yourselves know. This man handed over to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and you killed by the hands of those, you crucified. You Israelites, you crucified him and killed by the hands of those outside the law, including also those who were not Jews, is right. But God raised him up, having freed him from death. And then he concludes this, I won't read the whole thing. He concludes this last saying with these final words. Therefore, let the entire house of Israel know with certainty, all the Jews know with certainty, that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, made Jesus both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified, right? There we have it. The gates are opened by Peter himself in the hand of Luke, writing the Acts of the Apostles. Already by the time that Luke is writing this, the Jews are being accused of killing Jesus. And we can see this probably as a result of conflict that's going on within the synagogues. You followers of Jesus, we want you out. No, we're good Jews. You just don't see that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, by 100, the conflict has become so great that we can presume that Gentile followers of Jesus are out of the synagogue. Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah, they're out of the synagogue, and intra-Jewish arguments about the Messiah are soon going to become anti-Jewish arguments, already present in the Luke, the Acts of the Apostles written by Luke. So let me stop there give my voice a rest and see if you have any comments about that.
Dan,
Yeah,
is there a time frame for when Peter is speaking? This accusation that is
well,
reflected, that appears in Acts?
yeah, as the story goes, this would be at Pentecost. Shavuot is the Jewish festival of the giving of the law at Sinai. And Luke knows what he's doing here. You know, let's assume that Luke is taking some liberties with the story. We don't know, of course, if this happened, but the symbolism of it happening is very, very important. Jews are in Jerusalem to commemorate the giving of the law at Sinai. Now, remember, the giving of the law at Sinai is attended or accompanied by this myth, this tradition, that when God gave the law, the covenant, God intended it for all of the nations of the world, the 70 nations of the world. That number 70 refers to the Gentiles. But it was only the Jews who had the fortitude and had the faith to take up the covenant, and all of the other nations of the world rejected it. But now, with the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, says Luke, there is a new law given, and this one is for the nations of the world in such a way that they don't have to follow this covenant, which was too strenuous for them. But now it's a matter of God's grace. And so this is what really what Luke wants to get across. Now, the story goes that this would have happened 50 days after Passover. It comes to be known not as Shavuot, but the Greek word is Pentecost, meaning 50 days, and the coming of the Holy Spirit. And that's going to be this Holy Spirit, which is going to allow for communication and understanding among all the nations. This is very clear in Luke, However, with this understanding among all the nations comes this other result that the Jews are now going to start to be accused of killing their Messiah. I don't know if that answers your question, Denny. Does it?
I was wondering how soon after the crucifixion of Jesus, you know, do we think that Peter made this accusation?
I don't know that Peter ever made the accusation. We don't know if Peter ever made the accusation. I mean, the story, if you call the story a historical rendering of facts, it would be 50 days. But I think what Fredrickson is trying to say is that this is an orientation, a perspective that's placed in the mouth of Peter to give it legitimacy. And this is certainly in place by 100 of the Common Era. It's not clear to me. I'd have to think about this, but I'm kind of stepping out, and I'll ask some of you to make your offer your insights on this. I'm not really sure that I can't think of any way we would know if Peter ever made this claim. Luke says he did, but it's serving Luke's purposes as he's writing the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Mac, you got a comment?
And Luke's writing this 50 years after the fact.
50 years, at least 50 years after.
At least 50. I think that I was interested that Paula tends to date Gospels and New Testament writings a little later than a lot of scholars. It seems to me,
Yeah.
and by a little, I mean, we're talking 5 years sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would interpose a question to you, or for your opinion, I guess, is, I remember you saying once, and I remember when we studied Spong on the John book, that there was kind of a reticence to even get into John because of the reputation of anti-Semitism. But once
Yeah.
Spong got into it, he then in that book termed it his favorite gospel. And I think that
Mhm.
may have changed your view as well after you read it.
Right.
So don't you think that we're still talking here about intra-Jewish
Yes. Yes.
discussions? We haven't quite hit the anti-Semitism, although they're intra-Jewish discussions can then form the basis later for
Right.
anti-Semitism.
Yeah. It's still in seminal form, you might say. The inter-Jewish is still in, it's starting it's starting to grow, but you're right. It's not become completely anti-Jewish yet. This is rhetorical what Peter's doing, but you can see that the transition is starting to be made in the God, even in the Acts of the Apostles.
And all of the writers of the Gospels are Jewish.
Yeah, yeah. Well, except for Luke, right? I mean, he's a Gentile.
I'm not sure. Are you sure he's a Gentile?
Well,
I'm not. And that just may be a gap in my knowledge, or I'm not remembering things correctly. But I know he's appealing to the Gentiles. He's writing for the
yeah.
Gentiles, and Matthew's writing for the Jews. But whether he was Jewish or not, I don't know. I
Mhm.
kind of always assumed he was, but maybe
Oh,
I
really? Well,
misapprehend that.
I now you're making me question my knowledge of this. I always assumed he was a Gentile who, who accompanied Paul. Maybe, I mean, if he was a Jew, he would certainly have been one of the Hellenized Jews that, that would have been similar to Paul in that respect.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, Yeah, it just shows the complexity of all this. Well, now I'm going to have to start doing some research on this. My assumption has always been that he's one of the God-fearers that, uh, heard the message and, and took up his cross, so to speak. Uh, Whatever the case, we certainly get a perspective in this that he is, placing in the mouth of Peter this notion that you know, this antipathy that we're seeing in being played out in the synagogue is now starting to be very accusatory. You know, you Jews are going to be left. You killed your Messiah, and by the time we get to the next century, it's going to be seen. What happens to the Jews. We also have to keep in mind that this is being written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. A good 20 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So other questions are starting to arise in the minds of Christians as well. If these are God's chosen people, then why did God allow for the complete destruction of this beautiful temple built by Herod, right? And if for no other reason, then this must be some sort of punishment. Well, what was the reason for the punishment? Well, could it be because the Jews turned their back on Jesus? That is starting to, foment a little bit as well. Anyway, other comments about this?
Where is Paul in this whole, anti-Jewish, intra-Jewish dialogue?
Well, we know from Paul's letter that he is asking some of these questions if we read especially Galatians, right? So he's writing somewhere between 48 and 58 of the Common Era, give or take a few years before the destruction of the temple. He's writing to people in churches that he's established in Asia Minor and in that area of present day Turkey and Greece. And we know that he he's struggling with this idea. And we talked a little bit about Romans last time, and there's a very complex section of Romans chapter 9 through 11, where Paul is trying to understand why it is that the Jews are not accepting Jesus. And he's already, even by the time he's writing Romans, which is the last letter that he writes of the authentic letters of Paul, he sees that, well, I showed you this last time, that even among the people of Israel, there are those who are rejecting Jesus. Israel as a whole has rejected Jesus. And among those of the Church of God, who have accepted Jesus, there is something called the true Israel, and it will consist of both Jews and Gentiles. Remember in Galatians, it says there's no longer slave nor free. This is the place where Paul introduces something that is going to be foundational to Presbyterianism. God already knows this powder blue section in the middle. God has foreordained, predestined these people from the very beginning. All of this is part of God's plan. That's the only way that Paul can explain it, because it just doesn't make sense that the people of Israel would deny their own Messiah. But there's something more mystical in the mind of God that's going on, that when we see the earthly church and when we see the earthly Israel, among those, there are some who are foreordained to be the true Israel of God. Very complex thinking on the part of Paul, and not easy to understand in a lot of ways. But remember also, Paul has that wonderful imagery of the Gentiles being in the same section, right? Being grafted onto the body of Israel, not going off and starting a new community of which Jews are welcome to join, right? It's almost like a tree, a fruit tree, onto which you graft a new twig or new branch, and it produces a slightly different type of fruit. Well, the main tree is Judaism. The grafted branch is the Gentiles. So Paul has that imagery as well. So, it's hard to know where Paul ends up on this by the time he's executed. But he certainly is starting to see that many Jews are rejecting Jesus. And he has a hard time with those people who are called Judaizers, those who want the people of the church to follow the rituals, ceremonies, to observe the law of Judaism. So, does that answer your question, Danny?
Yes.
Yes and no, probably.
Yes and no. Yeah, right.
So the question really becomes who's the real Israel? Because throughout Scripture, we know that Israel is God's chosen people. Well, ostensibly, Israel are the people of God who accepted the covenant and who are referred to as Jews. But the mystical Israel, right? Now the possibility arises that there is really kind of a visible Israel, but with the coming of Jesus and the Holy Spirit being introduced, there is a spiritual Israel as well. And the former is not as legitimate as the latter, let's put it that way. That there is, the church can see itself as the new spiritual Israel. And we see this, starting to be spoken about and written about in Justin and Origen, and especially the people writing in that 2nd century context. And they're also the ones who, on the other side of further destruction of Jerusalem, something that Fredrickson makes a reference to just obliquely, but we know that the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, and this is what this image here by David Roberts refers to. But shortly after that, well, I should say 65 years after that, there was another revolution in Israel. Once again, Jews rising up to try to oust or, to throw out their Roman occupiers, called the Bar Kokhba Revolution. And they were summarily, I mean, very easily just descended upon by the Romans and destroyed once again. And Jerusalem, a couple of generations later is experiencing the same kind of destruction. Well, that reality, that event in the hands of Christian apologists comes to be seen as vindication of the church, right? Because now we have two examples of Israel being, punished by God. This destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem under Bar Kokhba is a punitive execution or a punitive event. And the scattering of Israel after Bar Kokhba, that's when the real scattering takes place. Jews go off to Alexandria, Jews go off to Babylon, Jews go off to, present day Turkey, Asia Minor, and they are no longer, seen as, Jerusalem is really no longer seen as their actual homeland where they're living. So it's during this, after the Bar Kokhba revolution, that the intra-Jewish argument about Jews killing the Messiah now becomes really anti-Jewish, because we see that there seems to be some evidence that God himself is punishing the Jews, right? God himself is punishing the Jews. And so the idea, here's where the place where I'm most frustrated, because there's much about this second century context that suggests that there are still churches who are observing Jewish ritual. If there's I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, so I might as well just move to that as well. Yeah, well, no, because I wanted to read this quote by I keep saying Pagels. I wanted to read this quote by Fredrickson as well. But something that I'll talk about after I read that quote is that it's clear that in the first century, there are still churches, and even into the second century, there are still churches that are practicing Jewish ritual and considering themselves as Christian. We know this because the Didache, and then later texts like the Didaskalia Apostolorum, or the teaching of the apostles, is very, very clearly Jewish in its orientation. We see holdovers in the letter to the Hebrews and James, in the letter of James, right? There's a tradition that seems to have its source in Peter and James, the apostles, James, the reputed brother of Jesus, that is still carrying on. But I wanted to read this quote of Fredrickson because I thought it was very good. We're only page 19 in our text, I'm sorry. This mode of thinking with Jews, in other words, trying to figure out how Jews played into the role of, the coming of Christ, as the defining Christian other, while claiming the positive prerogative as Israel for the church. The Jews were the other, but now the church is moving in and saying that we're the true Israel. This became a drive wheel of patristic theology. This is the move from intra to intra-argumental to intra-Jewish. What was I saying before? I'm sorry. Intra-Jewish arguments versus anti-Jewish arguments. Just had a brain freeze there, sorry. Traditions contra Judaeos, contra the Jews, went on to serve multiple purposes. By identifying Jewish interpretations and Jewish enactments of Jewish scriptures with inferior flesh and Christian understandings with superior spirit, right? There is the fleshly Israel, but then there's the spiritual Israel, which is the church. Theologians pried these prestigious ancient writings loose from their communities of origin, talking about the Old Testament writings, eventually by the 4th century, turning them into the Old Testament of the church. I mean, there's a value judgment that's made with that, the Old Testament, right? These interpretations validated Christian allegorical readings of Jewish scriptures as codes for Christ. So by the 2nd century, we're starting to see Jewish scriptures being used, as we saw right here in the Acts of the Apostles, prophecies being used to uphold the affirmation of Christ as the Messiah. And these prophecies, as we know, even by what we see in the New Testament, are manipulated by the writers. The one that I read to you that said, in the last days, this is from Joel, in the last days, God declares that I will pour out my spirit. When Joel, it does not say in the last days. It says after this, right? After this temporal event that takes place, when God's punishment is clear and then a renewal will happen. So Luke is adding an eschatological aspect to this. Another example of how scripture and prophecy is manipulated by the gospel writers. I think it's in the Gospel of John where it says, and this is, no, or maybe it's in Matthew, I'm sorry. And this is done to fulfill the prophecy of a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord at the, prior to Jesus' baptism, that there would be one who would come to be his precursor. Well, in Isaiah, which is the prophecy on which that passage is based, it doesn't say, this is the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord. It says instead, a voice cries out in the wilderness, comma, prepare the way for the Lord, So it has nothing to do with, John the Baptist, being the precursor, the harbinger of Jesus. So these prophecies, you can see, even when we read the biblical text, are being manipulated by the writers, writers that are writing sometime between 70 and 100 of the Common Era. Any thoughts about that? Sorry, I'm not on my game today. I can't remember where that prophecy appears.
Well, Dan,
Yeah.
we just read a book that
Yeah.
tied Jesus, the New Testament, and the writing of the New Testament to the traditional Jewish holidays.
Yeah. All right. Exactly. Yeah. Very true. Well, moving on. Pagels once, Pagels, darn it, Denny Fredrickson.
Sorry.
Fredrickson wants to make the point that there is really no, single Gentile church, even by the 4th century, which is a difficult time because after Constantine, there comes to be a pretty established way to be a church, Gentile or Jewish. But there are those who are going to persist in their own beliefs. There are those that are going to be virulently anti-Jewish, and there are those who are going to be, pro-Jewish. I talked very briefly there about the Didache. And I've often wanted to do just a couple week class on the Didache because it's a very, it's a book that's written probably around the same time as Mark, maybe a little bit earlier, 55 to 70 of the Common Era. that talks about the rituals of the church and how people become baptized, how there needs to be a mentoring that goes on for new adherents to the gospel, baptism and the ritual. And it really, it's a beautiful text, but it is about as Jewish as it comes. This idea that the mentoring takes place is based on the notion of Proverbs, hear the word of the teacher. And so there will be this ritual preparation for a period of the year, at which time 40 days before the baptism, there would be this Lenten observance, what we know of as Lent, where there would be prayer and fasting, not on the part necessarily of the acolyte alone, the person who's becoming part of the church, the convert, but on the part of the whole church. The whole church was praying in preparation for the day of Easter, the only day on which baptism would take place. Boy, there's a lot of Jewishness that goes into that, and we might suspect that the Didache, which is really foundational for this later writing of the 4th century called the Didascalia Apostolorum, the teachings of the apostles, that persists all the way into the 4th century. But there are those, and you probably know about Marcion, maybe you don't, but there is a virulently anti-Jewish branch of the church as well. Now, this man by the name of Marcion, I think he was 2nd century, and I have to check my thinking on that. Remember, there's Gnostic Christianity as well, that Jesus comes to bring this new type of knowledge that frees us from this physical world. Well, Marcion took that idea and said the God of the Old Testament, now being called the Old Testament, was not even the true God. He wasn't even the true God, that Jesus came to reveal the what's the right word I'm looking for? Jesus came to reveal how this God was an imposter. This was a God of blood sacrifices and very earthly, mundane things that have nothing to do with true spirituality. So Marcion, proposed that the entire Old Testament be completely jettisoned, right? Would be later on that Marcion would be declared a heretic. So the church is trying to, create some sort of balance between these two approaches. Justin and Tertullian, for example, building on the idea that, that Rome is kind of innocent in this, develop apologetic suggesting that Rome is actually a tool of God in this, that God is using Rome to bring about this, the execution of Jesus, which is going to bring about the salvation of the world. But goodness, Frederickson, darn you, Denny. Frederickson wants to make it clear that there is positive Jewish engagement that's going on from the time of Jesus all the way to at least the 4th century. And this is one that recognizes Jesus as a prophet in the line of Moses, that it comes to bring a new covenant. And to kind of give you some factual proof of what was happening, not so much proof, but we know that Judaism is still very strong, even in places close to Jerusalem. We know that the Jews have been kind of chased out after the Bar Kokhba revolution, but in an area even as close as the border of Lebanon, or current day Lebanon, and Israel, Palestine, there's this luxurious synagogue that is that's the ruins of which are still able to be visited. This is known as the Bahram Synagogue. Did you happen to visit this when you all were there? Do you remember that?
I don't think so.
Yeah. But you could see it's pretty elaborate. So it's not like Judaism is completely dying out in this part of the world. We tend to think that it is, that Christianity is displacing it, but not so. And in Alexandria, in Asia Minor, in Babylon, Judaism is still alive and well and doing quite nicely. But the question, who is Israel? What is God's plan in all of this? And I'll just say this because our time is almost upon us. But there was this apologetic letters going back and forth between two 4th and 5th century theologians, one by the name of Paulinus, I guess is how you would say it, and then Saint Augustine. This is, Philippe de Champagne, I guess is how you'd say it. This is Saint Augustine, and he's holding his heart, which was set ablaze by the hearing of God's word. That you can see Veritas up here, in reference to Augustine hearing at the time of his conversion a voice saying, "Take up and read," and he takes up Paul's letter from the Romans, and his heart is, I don't want to say strangely warmed, because that's going to come much later with the Wesleys, right? But his heart was burning on the recognition of the truth of this, that Jesus is the Messiah, and through Jesus, God saves by grace and not by any works. That, despite all of his sinning of the past, as a wayfaring man, as a person who indulged in all the delights of fleshly existence, God could nevertheless, accept Augustine and forgive him of his sins. But then the question becomes, well, if God loves Israel, then why the scattering that takes place? And Augustine is kind of the opinion that, well, God is using Israel in a way to make the gospel known. Or Paulinus is saying, no, God is still wanting to keep Israel within the fold, because if that were not the case, then how do you read the psalm where it says, scatter your beloved, or scatter your people, lest they forget your law? So in the scattering of the people, there is a plan that God is going to allow them to maintain the law. This is part of God's plan. So Paulinus, at least, is of the opinion that the Jews are still God's beloved people. Augustine, on the other hand, sees the Jews as a tool in the hands of God. And this is where we conclude with Fredrickson's quote. And this is on page 23, so that's where we'll end. The Jews, indeed, Augustine says, had been scattered with the temple's destruction in 70 of the Common Era. So that reference to Psalms is seen now as a reference, a foreordaining, or, as pointing towards the destruction of the temple. But this scattering had been to the benefit of the church. The prestigious antiquity of their books, their continuing attachment to them, all served to convince pagans of the gospel's truth. That was the utility of the Jews, not forgetting their law. As for Paul's statement on the redemption of all Israel, that cannot refer to Israel secundum carnem, Israel according to the flesh, but only Israel secundum spiritum, spiritual Israel, the church. So in many ways, Augustine is adhering to what we'll talk about next time, called supersessionism, that the spiritual church is God's concern now, and that the statement of redemption of all of Israel does not refer to the fleshly Israel. That's what Paulinus was arguing for, but refers to, in this kind of mystical way, to the church, of which now Augustine is a part. So you can see that the separation is beginning, and by the 4th century, it's become fairly clear that there is a a clear distinction between the church and the people of Israel. Thoughts about this? Any comments?
You know,
Um,
I'm wondering, Dan, how old is the Vatican in Rome? You know, when can we say, and this is very difficult, I'm sure, to historically pin down exact dates, but an era in which the single church as we think of it in Rome is recognized as such.
Oh, well, that's because you have the Byzantine. Remember, the church is going to move in the 5th century, and it's going to have its, well, no, actually, it's going to move in the 4th century, and it's going to have its seat in Constantinople, the city of Constantine, right? And the the bishops there are going to be seen as kind of the authority. This is where we get the the church fathers, that they're all writing in Greek at this time. Eventually the church, the Eastern Church and the Western Church, are going to split, and that happens, I believe it's 1054, and it's then that the Bishop of Rome becomes the so-called Pope. Prior to that, he was simply seen as the Bishop of Rome. Now, I may be corrected on this, because I have to admit that this is a part of my understanding of church history that I'm still a little fuzzy on. But until the fall of Constantinople, in the Byzantine era, the center of the church was Constantine. But that does not mean that Rome wasn't important. There was still a bishop there. There was still a church there, but they seemed to be taking their marching orders from Constantinople. Does that make sense, Denny? It
Yes.
doesn't answer your
Yes.
question.
No, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I before I leave this world, I need to really shape up my knowledge of that part of history, because it's so important. For some reason, I've just never gotten into the Byzantine era, and I don't know why that is. But it's a time that a lot of the early church fathers' theology is being written. A lot of the councils are being convened to decide on matters of theology. But it's not happening in Rome. It's happening over in present day Turkey. So, all right. Well, our time is on us. I hope you're, still engaged with the book. We'll probably really, the next section of this on, is simply referred to as on page 23. That's where we stopped, excuse me, the rhetorical Jews versus the historical Jews. That's really what we're talking about. The historical Jews are the Israel, the secundum carnum, the fleshly Israel. And the rhetorical Jews are now the new church, the spiritual Israel. And the next section tries to unpack that a little bit more. But then next time, I think if we move into the second chapter, the dilemmas of diversity, we'll probably get into that, because I really think the section that we're about to get into on historical versus rhetorical is just a kind of summary of everything that we've just talked about. So, any thoughts about that? Well, good. Thank you for engaging, and I hope to see you next week. I don't have any conflicts that I know of, so let's count on it. Okay. So let me stop this share, and I'll talk to you all later. Okay.